They say life can turn on a dime, and for me, it happened at a baseball game. It was a crisp fall afternoon, the kind of day that feels perfect. I was at the stadium to watch my Sycamores take on the Boilermakers, hot dog in one hand, beer in the other, ready to lose myself in the game. Then she walked in, a gorgeous brunette with a smile sharp enough to cut through the noise of the crowd. Megan. She slid into the seat beside me, her perfume light but impossible to ignore. When our eyes met, I felt something I couldn't explain. She didn't notice me at first, at least not until the second inning. A close play at third had everyone on their feet, arguing with the umpire. She turned to me, her eyes alive with curiosity, and asked, "What do you think? Safe or out?" I played it cool, analyzing the play with more drama than a commentator. She laughed, God, that laugh, and just like that, the game faded into the background. By the seventh inning stretch, I knew her name, her alma mater, and the fact that she'd never let me live down being a Sycamore fan. By the ninth inning, I knew I didn't want her to walk out of my life. 3 years later, she walked down a different aisle, and this time, it was to me. The early years of our marriage were as close to perfect as you could get. We bought a little farmhouse on the edge of town, with a garden that Megan filled with flowers and a porch that became our sanctuary. Evenings were slow and easy, talking about our day, making plans for the future, enjoying the kind of peace people spend their whole lives chasing. I worked as an English lit professor at the university, and Megan thrived at a marketing firm downtown. She was sharp, driven, and ambitious. I love that about her. When Megan got promoted to lead a national campaign, I couldn't have been prouder. She deserved it. She worked hard for years. At first, I did everything I could to support her. I took on more of the housework, cooked dinners, and made sure to be the calm to her chaos. She appreciated it, or at least I thought she did. "What would I do without you, Ethan?" she'd say with a smile that made it all worth it. But then things started to change. The dinners I made began to sit uneaten. Megan would brush past them, muttering. I grabbed something at work. The massages that used to relax her now irritated her. "Not now, Ethan. I'm too tired." Her hours at the office grew longer, and when she was home, she was glued to her phone or tablet, scrolling in silence. It was like she wasn't even there anymore, just a shadow of the woman I'd married. I tried not to let it get to me. She was under a lot of stress, and I told myself that this was just a rough patch. But the distance between us kept growing, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, I met up with my friend Paul for drinks. If anyone could set me straight, it was him. I laid it all out, the late nights, the silence, the lack of intimacy. "It's like she's not even my wife anymore," I said, staring into my glass. "We're just two people living in the same house." Paul frowned, taking a slow sip of his beer. "That's rough, man. I never thought you two would hit a wall like this." He hesitated, then leaned in. "Ethan, have you thought that maybe she's seeing someone else?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "No," I said firmly. "Megan wouldn't do that. She's not like that. I'm just saying," Paul continued, "it happens. You're here busting your ass to make things work, and she's pulling away. Doesn't add up, man." I didn't want to believe it, but the doubt was already there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. A few days later, I decided to surprise Megan at work. I picked up her favorite pizza from a place downtown, thinking maybe we could steal a moment together like we used to. When I walked into her office lobby, the receptionist gave me a strange look. "Your wife didn't mention you were coming," she said, almost like it was odd for me to show up. While I waited, 2 men strolled in, dressed sharp and reeking of arrogance. They talked loudly about expense accounts and penthouse suites, their laughter grating. Something about them rubbed me the wrong way. Was this the crowd Megan spent her time with now? When she finally appeared, she looked frazzled, her blouse slightly untucked, hair in a messy bun. "Ethan," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and something else, something defensive. "What are you doing here?" I held up the pizza. "Thought I'd surprise you. We could have lunch together, catch up." Her eyes darted toward the back offices. "That's sweet, but I can't. I'm swamped today. Maybe next week." "Not even 15 minutes?" I pressed, trying to keep my voice calm. For a moment, her face softened, and I saw a flicker of the Megan I used to know. But then her expression hardened, and she shook her head. "I really can, Ethan. I'll make it up to you, I promise." She disappeared before I could say another word, leaving me standing there with a pizza box growing colder by the second. The tipping point came a week later. We were at the airport, about to board a flight for a long overdue romantic getaway. I was determined to use the trip to reconnect, to remind Megan of what we had. But as we were checking in, one of those smug suits from her office strolled up. "Megan," he called, flashing a grin. "We need to talk about the proposal." My jaw tightened. "Can it wait?" I said sharply. "We're boarding." The guy didn't even look at me. "It's urgent," he insisted, leaning in to speak to Megan like I wasn't standing right there. Megan touched my arm. "Go ahead and grab our seats, Ethan. I'll be right behind you." "No," I said, my voice firm. "This can wait until we're back." She looked at me with those green eyes, the same eyes that had hooked me all those years ago. "Please, Ethan," she said, her tone pleading. "Just give me 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I walked away. I waited on that plane until the last call, my eyes fixed on the entrance, expecting to see her rushing down the aisle. She never came. When I landed, my phone buzzed with a message. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. Please check your email." My chest tightened as I opened it. The subject line read, "My confession." I didn't need to read the rest to know my world had just collapsed. As the plane landed, I felt the weight of the email pulling me under. The words "my confession" sat in my inbox like a bomb waiting to go off. My hands shook as I opened it, skimming over Megan's words. She didn't even try to sugarcoat it. For months, she admitted, for months of sneaking around with Jake, her smug coworker, while I was at home cooking her dinners, folding her laundry, and trying to make her life easier. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she wrote. "But Jake and I spent so much time together on the campaign. It just happened. I didn't know how to tell you, Ethan. I'm sorry." That's what she thought this deserved? A quick apology, wrapped in excuses? I couldn't even read the rest. I slammed my phone down on the seat tray, gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles went white. My mind raced. The betrayal wasn't just a knife in the back. It was a twist of everything I thought I knew. By the time the plane taxied to the gate, my blood was boiling. I stormed off, ignoring the concerned looks from the flight attendants. My phone buzzed again, a follow-up message from Megan. "Ethan, please don't hate me. I never wanted to hurt you." I deleted it without replying. At the baggage claim, I tried to steady my breathing, but the emotions were too much. Anger, humiliation, and heartbreak tangled in my chest. And before I knew it, I was snapping at an airport worker who asked if I needed help. "Do I look like I need help?" I barked, then immediately regretted it. But the damage was done. 2 security guards approached me, their expressions neutral but firm. "Sir, is everything all right?" one asked. "No," I muttered, shoving my phone into his hand. "My wife just admitted she's been cheating on me. That's what's wrong." The guard glanced at the screen, his expression softening. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir," he said, his tone quieter now. "Why don't we take a moment to calm down? We have a private area where you can collect yourself." Too tired to argue, I followed them down a quiet hallway. They led me into a plain room with a couple of chairs and left me alone. Sitting there, the enormity of it all hit me. Megan wasn't coming back. The woman I'd built a life with, the woman I thought I'd grow old with, had chosen someone else. For a moment, I thought about packing it all in and heading straight home. But the idea of walking into that empty farmhouse, filled with reminders of the life we'd built together, was too much. I needed time. After an hour, a security guard returned and asked if I was ready to leave. I nodded and headed for the shuttle that would take me to the resort, our resort. Except it wasn't ours anymore. When I reached the front desk, the overly cheery clerk greeted me with a smile. "Welcome, Mr. Mitchell. You and Mrs. Mitchell are booked in our honeymoon suite with an ocean view. Where's the lovely Mrs. Mitchell?" I clenched my teeth, trying to keep my voice even. "She's not coming," I said flatly. The clerk's smile faltered. "Oh, I see. Well, sir, this is a couples-only resort, and unfortunately, we don't accommodate single guests in the suites. It's part of maintaining the ambience." I felt my temper rising again. "Listen," I said, slapping my hand on the counter. "My wife just ditched me for another man. She's not coming. So why don't you skip the rules and get me a damn room?" The clerk looked nervous, her eyes darting to the side. Within seconds, a manager appeared, a calm older man in a suit. He smiled politely. Sir, I understand this is a difficult situation. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office. I followed him, still seething. In his office, he offered me a seat and spoke calmly. I can't place you in the honeymoon suite, but I can arrange for accommodations at our sister property down the beach. It's quieter and doesn't have the same restrictions. I wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. Fine, imaterd. Just make it quick. An hour later, I found myself in a modest room at the sister resort, staring out at the ocean I was supposed to be enjoying with Megan. But the view didn't matter. Nothing did. I spent the first night pacing the room, trying to figure out what to do next. By morning, I knew one thing. I wasn't going to sit around feeling sorry for myself. Megan had made her choice, and now I'd make mine. First, I called Paul. She admitted it. I said bluntly when he picked up, "For months with that slimeball coworker of hers." Paul swore under his breath. "What do you need, man? Just say the word." "I need a lawyer," I said. Paul didn't hesitate. "I got a guy. Henry Daniels. He doesn't pull punches. I'll text you his number." Henry turned out to be exactly what I needed, a no-nonsense lawyer with a reputation for playing hardball. I met him in his downtown office the day after I got back from the trip. "So, let me get this straight," Henry said, leaning back in his chair. "She's been carrying on with this coworker, and she left you high and dry at the airport before your vacation?" "That's the gist of it," I said. Henry's lips curled into a smirk. "Perfect. She's handed us the case on a silver platter. Here's what we'll do." He laid out the plan, a divorce filing that would highlight her infidelity and abandonment. We'd go after restitution for the ruined trip, legal fees, and any other damages we could squeeze out of her. "I'm not looking for revenge," I said. "I just want what's fair." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Fair?" "Ethan, fair went out the window the moment she walked away. Let me do my job." Over the next few weeks, Henry and his team worked fast. Megan was served with divorce papers at her office, and Paul couldn't resist sending me a text when he heard. "She's going to regret this," Paul wrote. I didn't reply, but I agreed. The court date came quicker than I expected. Megan showed up looking frazzled, her lawyer trying to paint her as a victim of overwhelming stress. Henry tore that argument apart. "Mrs. Mitchell," Henry said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that while your husband was home supporting you, cooking meals, taking care of the house, you were engaged in an affair with Mr. Jake Tanner?" Megan squirmed in her seat. "Yes, but—" "And isn't it also true," Henry continued, his voice cutting, "that you abandoned your husband at the airport just before a long-awaited vacation he had planned and paid for?" Megan's eyes flickered toward me, but I held her gaze. She looked away. "Yes," she whispered. Henry turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my client deserves restitution for the financial and emotional damages caused by Mrs. Mitchell's actions. This is a clear case of infidelity and abandonment." The judge didn't even flinch. By the end of the day, the ruling was in my favor. Megan was ordered to pay restitution for the trip, cover my legal fees, and forfeit any claim to the farmhouse. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of control. Megan had tried to break me, but she'd failed. Henry clapped me on the back. "See? I told you we'd nail her." "You're worth every penny," I said. "Damn right I am," he replied with a grin. As I drove home, the farmhouse felt different. It wasn't a reminder of what I'd lost anymore. It was a symbol of what I'd reclaimed. My life, my dignity, and the next chapter was mine to write. The farmhouse felt quieter than ever, but this time, the silence wasn't haunting, it was liberating. For weeks after the court ruling, I focused on rebuilding, piece by piece. Megan was out of my life, legally and emotionally. I could finally think clearly, unburdened by the constant second-guessing and emotional weight her betrayal had brought into my home. But freedom didn't mean peace. The farmhouse was filled with reminders of what had been, from the garden Megan had once loved to the shelves of books we'd picked out together during our first year of marriage. I wasn't the kind of man to wallow in self-pity, though. I decided that if she could walk away so easily, I could just as easily erase her from my life. I started by tackling the garden. The once vibrant patch Megan had planted was now overrun with weeds, a perfect metaphor for our marriage. I ripped out everything, one root at a time, until there was nothing left but clean soil. It felt like ripping away her hold on me, tearing down every memory she'd left behind. Inside the house, I stripped away her touch. I boxed up everything that screamed Megan. Her photos, the little knickknacks she insisted on decorating with, and even the cushions she had chosen for the couch. Each box felt like a step forward of the reclamation of my space. During this time, Paul checked in regularly, making sure I wasn't sliding into bitterness. "How's it going?" he asked one night over a beer at my place. "Better," I said simply, gesturing around the now sparsely decorated living room. "I'm clearing her out. It's starting to feel like mine again." Paul raised his bottle in a toast. "Here's to new beginnings." We clinked bottles, and for the first time, I actually believed the words. It was around this time that I got a call from Henry. "Ethan, I've been thinking," he said in his usual straightforward tone. "What's your plan now? What are you doing with your time?" I shrugged, even though he couldn't see me. "Teaching, cleaning up the house, figuring things out." "Why?" "Well, you handled yourself damn well through this divorce. Level-headed, focused. I could use someone like you at my firm." I laughed. "You're kidding, right? I'm an English professor, Henry. I don't know the first thing about law." "You don't need to yet," he replied. "Go to law school. I'll mentor you. You've got the discipline, and I can teach you the rest." The idea was so absurd it almost made me hang up. But as we talked, something about it started to make sense. My life needed direction, and Henry was offering me more than just a job. He was offering me a way to turn my pain into purpose. By the end of the call, I'd agreed to look into it. The next few months were a whirlwind. I applied to law schools, started studying for the entrance exams, and prepared myself for a new chapter one never thought I'd write. At night, I pored over textbooks, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. Paul, of course, couldn't resist ribbing me about it. "Ethan Mitchell, future lawyer. Never thought I'd see the day. You gonna wear one of those fancy suits like Henry?" I smirked. "Don't hold your breath. I'm more of a button-down and jeans guy." Despite the jokes, Paul was supportive, always reminding me why I was doing this. "You're turning the worst thing that ever happened to you into something good," he said one night. "That's more than most people can say." As the months went on, I started to find my footing again. I focused on my studies, my work, and rebuilding the parts of myself Megan had tried to break. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. I was sitting in on a chamber orchestra performance on campus, a requirement for a music appreciation class I'd picked up to fill some spare hours. I wasn't thrilled about it. Classical music wasn't really my thing, but as the orchestra played, my eyes caught on a woman sitting a few rows ahead. She was petite, with dark hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders. There was something striking about the way she sat, graceful but relaxed, completely absorbed in the music. When intermission came, she turned, giving me a clear view of her face for the first time. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. There was a warmth to her expression, a kind of quiet confidence that drew me in. Before I could stop myself, I walked over. "Excuse me," I said, feeling a little out of place. "I don't mean to bother you, but you seem like someone who actually appreciates this music. Mind if I ask what you think of the performance?" She looked up, startled at first, but then she smiled. A smile that felt real, not the forced politeness I'd grown used to. "It's beautiful," she said, "but I'm probably biased. I play the cello, so this kind of music speaks to me." "Cello?" I asked, intrigued. "You must be pretty talented." She laughed softly. "I'm Grace," she said, holding out her hand. "Ethan," I replied, shaking it. We spent the rest of the intermission talking, and by the time the concert ended, I didn't want the conversation to stop. "There's a pub across the street," I said. "Care to join me for a drink?" Grace hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Why not?" We spent hours at that pub, trading stories and getting to know each other. Grace was a graduate student in art and animation, with dreams of working for a studio like Pixar. She talked about her work with a passion that was contagious, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something other than anger or sadness. Over the next few weeks, Grace and I became friends. She'd stop by the farmhouse for coffee, and I'd visit her on campus to see her latest projects. She brought a lightness into my life I didn't realize I'd been missing. One afternoon, She wandered out to the garden while I made sandwiches for lunch. When she came back, her eyes were sparkling. "Ethan, do you know you have an entire plot of land out there just waiting for a garden?" I shrugged. "It's been a while since I've done anything with it." "You have to let me fix it up," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Gardening is so therapeutic. You'd be amazed what it can do." I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "If it means you'll stick around, the garden's all yours." Her face lit up, and for the first time in years, I felt hope. Grace wasn't Megan. She wasn't trying to take anything from me or tear me down. She was simply there, reminding me that there was still good in the world. It wasn't a romance, not yet, but it was something I hadn't had in a long time, a connection that didn't feel forced or fragile. Grace was proof that even after betrayal, life had a way of surprising you. And for the first time since Megan walked out of my life, I was ready for those surprises. Grace's presence in my life was like a fresh breeze blowing away the lingering storm clouds Megan had left behind. She wasn't pushy or demanding, and she didn't carry the same weight of expectation that had hung over my marriage. Instead, she was light, warm, and incredibly patient, a quality I hadn't realized I needed until she walked into my life. At first, we were simply friends, and I was fine with that. After everything I'd been through, the idea of rushing into something new felt reckless. Grace seemed to understand this without me having to explain. She had her own life to focus on, her art, her cello, and her graduate program, and she never made me feel like she was waiting for something more from me. But as we spent more time together, it became clear that our connection was more than platonic. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace and I sat on the porch of the farmhouse, sipping tea and listening to the cicadas hum. She had spent the day working on the garden she'd insisted on reviving, and her face was still flushed from the effort. "You know," she said, glancing at me with a small smile, "this place has so much potential. It's peaceful, almost like it's just waiting for something new to grow here." I chuckled. "That's one way to look at it. I guess I've been too busy clearing out the old to think about starting fresh." She tilted her head, studying me. "Clearing out is part of it, though, isn't it? You can't grow something new until you've made space for it." Her words stuck with me, not just because they were true, but because they mirrored how I felt about my life. Megan had left behind a mess, an emotional garden overrun with weeds. But Grace was right. Clearing out the old was only the first step. Over the next few weeks, Grace became a regular fixture at the farmhouse. She brought over seedlings and tools, and we worked side by side in the garden, turning the barren plot into something vibrant and full of life. It wasn't just about the plants, though. It was about the time we spent together, the quiet conversations, and the shared laughter. One afternoon, as we finished planting a row of lavender, Grace sat back on her heels and wiped the sweat from her brow. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Now all it needs is time." "Time and water," I added with a grin. She laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Fair enough. But it's a start, right?" "A good one," I agreed. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself looking forward to her visits more and more. She had a way of bringing light into even the darkest corners of my life, and I couldn't deny the feelings that were starting to grow. But I was cautious. I'd been burned before, and the last thing I wanted was to hurt Grace or myself by diving in too quickly. Then one evening, something shifted. Grace had come over for dinner, and we were sitting in the kitchen talking about everything and nothing. She was telling me about a new art project she was working on, a series of paintings inspired by music, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "What's wrong?" I asked, noticing the way her expression had changed. She hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing. I was thinking about how different things feel here. With you." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "Different how?" She met my gaze, her eyes soft but serious. "Safe. Like I can just be myself. It's nice." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to keep everything together while Megan's world revolved around her own needs. With Grace, it was different. There was no pretense, no pressure, just a simple, honest connection between two people who genuinely enjoyed being together. Before I could respond, she stood up and started clearing the table, breaking the moment. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The following week, Grace surprised me by showing up with a picnic basket and a blanket. "I thought we could take a break from the garden today," she said with a grin. She led me to a quiet spot near the edge of the property, where the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing. We spread out the blanket and settled in, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over everything. As we ate, Grace talked about her plans for the future, her dream of working for an animation studio, her hopes of traveling, and the projects she wanted to create. Her passion was infectious, and I found myself sharing dreams I hadn't voiced in years. "You know," I said, staring up at the sky, "I used to think I had everything figured out. A steady job, a house, a marriage. I thought that was all I needed. And now," she asked, her voice gentle. "Now I'm not so sure," I admitted. "But maybe that's a good thing. It's like you said, clearing out the old to make room for the new." She smiled, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was comfortable, filled with the hum of nature and the unspoken understanding between us. It was that night, as I watched her pack up the picnic basket and head back toward the house, that I realized how much I cared for her. She wasn't just a friend or a distraction from the pain Megan had caused. She was someone I could see myself building a future with. But I knew I had to be careful. Grace deserved more than a man still piecing himself back together. If I was going to pursue something with her, I had to make sure I was ready. As the weeks went on, our connection deepened. Grace moved into the spare room of the farmhouse, partly to save money and partly because we both knew it was where she belonged. Living together brought new challenges, but it also brought us closer. One night, as we were sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the darkness, Grace turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Ethan," she said softly, "do you ever think about what you want now? I mean, after everything?" I took a deep breath, considering her question. "I want peace," I said finally. "And maybe I want someone who's willing to build something with me from the ground up." She smiled, her eyes shining with something I couldn't quite name. "That's a good answer," she said. It wasn't long after that night that everything between us shifted again. We were in the garden, working on a new row of flowers, when I tripped over a loose stone and stumbled. Grace reached out, grabbing my arm to steady me. "Careful," she said, her voice full of concern. I laughed, brushing myself off. "Guess I'm not as graceful as you." She rolled her eyes, but didn't let go of my arm. "You don't have to do everything on your own, you know. We're a team now." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything else faded away. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized there was no reason to hold back anymore. Before I could overthink it, I leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't rushed or hesitant. It was exactly what it needed to be. When we finally pulled apart, she smiled up at me, her cheeks flushed. "About time," she said with a laugh. From that moment on, everything changed. Grace and I weren't just rebuilding our own lives. We were building something together. It wasn't always easy, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Megan was a chapter when it closed, and Grace was the beginning of a story I couldn't wait to write. Megan's sudden reappearance caught me off guard, though I suppose I should have expected it. People like her don't just walk away quietly when they realize the world isn't bending to their will anymore. It was a few months after the divorce had been finalized, and I was well into my new rhythm, balancing my work at the university, my law school applications, and the quiet companionship Grace and I had built. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. That afternoon, I was out by the garden, trimming the lavender Grace had planted, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I glanced up, expecting Paul, or maybe even Henry. But when I saw Megan stepping out of a sleek black sedan, my stomach twisted. She was dressed sharply, as always, her sunglasses perched on top of her head, and an expression that was hard to read. "What are you doing here?" I asked, setting the clippers down and wiping my hands on my jeans. She hesitated for a moment, then gave a small shrug. "I thought we should talk." "About what?" I said flatly, not bothering to hide my irritation. She stepped closer, her heels crunching on the gravel, but stopped a few feet away. "Ethan, I know things didn't end well between us." I let out a bitter laugh. "That's one way to put it." Her expression faltered, but she pressed on. I wanted to apologize. For everything. I know I hurt you, and I've been carrying that guilt around ever since. You've been carrying it around? I said, my voice sharper now. Megan, you walked out on me? You left me at the airport with nothing but an email to explain yourself. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I know, she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. I know I handled it poorly. But Ethan, I wasn't in a good place back then. I was overwhelmed, confused. Confused? I shot back, my anger bubbling to the surface. You weren't confused, Megan. You made a choice. A selfish, calculated choice. And now that it's blown up in your face, you're here looking for what? Forgiveness? She flinched at my words, and for a moment, I thought she might turn and leave. But instead, she took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. I'm not here to make excuses. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized how much I took you for granted. You were always there for me, Ethan. Always. And I threw that away. I shook my head, a bitter smile creeping onto my face. You're right about one thing. You did throw it away, and I'm not interested in picking up the pieces. Her eyes darted to the farmhouse, as if searching for something or someone. I see you've been moving on, she said, her tone shifting. That woman I've heard about. Grace, isn't it? My jaw tightened. Leave her out of this. I'm not trying to stir anything up, Megan said quickly, holding up her hands. I'm just saying she's not me. No, I said firmly. She's not. And thank God for that. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and final. Megan's face fell, and for the first time, I saw something that almost resembled regret in her eyes. Almost. I guess I deserve that, she said softly. You deserve a lot of things, I replied, crossing my arms. But what you don't deserve is another second of my time. We're done, Megan. We've been done for a long time. Whatever guilt you're carrying, that's yours to deal with, not mine. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue, but then she nodded, her expression resigned. I hope you're happy, Ethan. I really do. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. I watched her drive away, feeling a strange mix of relief and anger. She had tried to rewrite the ending of our story, but I wasn't about to let her. Later that evening, as Grace and I sat on the porch, I told her about the encounter. She showed up here? Grace asked, her eyebrows rising in surprise. Yep, I said, taking a sip of my tea. Said she wanted to apologize. I think she just wanted to see if she still had any power over me. And does she? Grace asked, her tone light but curious. Not a chance, I said firmly. Grace smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. Good, because you deserve better than someone like her. For the first time in a long while, I believed that. As the weeks passed, Megan's visit became a distant memory, and I threw myself back into my work and studies. The law school application process was grueling, but Henry was a constant source of encouragement. You've got what it takes, Ethan, he told me during one of our meetings. Just keep your head down and push through. By the time acceptance letters started rolling in, I felt like I was finally in control of my life again. I chose a program that would allow me to keep teaching while attending classes part-time, balancing the two worlds I'd built for myself. Grace was thrilled when I told her. You're going to be amazing, she said, her eyes shining with pride. I'm just hoping I survive the first semester. I joked, though her confidence in me made the challenge feel less daunting. As law school began, my days became a blur of lectures, case studies, and late-night reading sessions. Grace was my anchor through it all, always finding ways to make life a little easier, whether it was cooking dinner when I was too tired or leaving encouraging notes in my textbooks. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I came home to find the farmhouse glowing with candlelight. Grace had prepared a simple but elegant dinner, complete with a bottle of wine and soft music playing in the background. What's all this? I asked, setting my bag down and loosening my tie. You've been working so hard, she said, walking over to wrap her arms around me. I thought you could use a little reminder of why you're doing it all. I smiled, pulling her closer. You're good at that, you know, reminding me what's important. Someone has to, she teased, her eyes sparkling. As we sat down to eat, I couldn't help but think about how far I'd come since that day at the airport. Megan's betrayal had nearly broken me, but it hadn't. If anything, it had forced me to find a strength I didn't know I had. Grace wasn't just part of my future. She was my partner in building it. Together, we were creating something Megan could never have understood. A relationship built on trust, respect, and mutual support. The night ended with us sitting on the porch, watching the stars and talking about everything and nothing. It was simple, but it was perfect, proof that sometimes the best things in life aren't grand gestures or dramatic moments. They're the quiet, steady beats that remind you of who you are and what you've survived. And as I held Grace's hand, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back, I was looking forward. The day my acceptance letter for law school arrived, it felt like the culmination of every difficult choice, every moment of pain, and every step forward I'd taken since Megan left. I held the envelope for a long moment, savoring the weight of it, knowing this wasn't just about starting a new career. It was about taking control of my life and proving to myself, and maybe even to Megan, that I wasn't the man she left behind. Grace found me on the porch, staring at the letter. "What are you waiting for?" she asked with a laugh, nudging my arm. I tore it open and skimmed the contents before a grin broke across my face. "I'm in," Grace squealed, throwing her arms around my neck. "I knew it. Ethan, this is amazing." We celebrated that night with takeout and a bottle of champagne she'd been saving for a special occasion. Sitting across from her, watching her eyes light up as she talked about how proud she was, I realized that everything Megan had taken from me, my confidence, my sense of purpose, my belief in myself, Grace had quietly helped me rebuild. The first few months of law school were grueling, but I thrived under the pressure. The long hours and endless reading weren't a burden. They were proof that I was capable of more than I'd ever given myself credit for. Henry became a mentor in every sense of the word, guiding me through the challenges and pushing me to think critically about every case, every argument. One evening, after a particularly intense lecture, Henry invited me out for a drink. As we sat in the dimly lit bar, he raised his glass. "To second chances," he said with a knowing smile. "To second chances," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. As the months rolled on, the farmhouse transformed into a true home. Grace's garden flourished, a riot of colors and life that brought joy to the once barren space. Inside, the walls that had felt empty and cold were now filled with warmth, her art, her laughter, and the quiet moments we shared after long days. One afternoon, as we worked side by side in the garden, Grace paused and wiped the dirt from her hands. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this place is starting to feel like it was meant for us." I looked at her, the sunlight catching in her dark hair, and felt a wave of gratitude. "It is," I said simply. By the time I finished my first year of law school, life had taken on a steady rhythm. Grace and I weren't just surviving, we were thriving. And while Megan's betrayal had once felt like the end of everything, I could now see it for what it truly was, the beginning of something far better. One evening, as Grace and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, she reached for my hand. "Ethan, do you ever think about the future? About what's next for us?" I squeezed her hand, a smile tugging at my lips. "All the time," because for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a question mark. It felt like a promise I couldn't wait to keep. The evening air was cool and crisp, the kind of weather that made everything feel a little sharper, a little more alive. Grace and I sat on the porch of the farmhouse, her hand resting lightly on mine as we watched the sun dip below the horizon. It was a quiet moment, but one filled with unspoken meaning. In the months since I had started law school, life had taken on a new kind of rhythm. It was busy, no doubt, between my studies, my work, and Grace's own creative pursuits. Our days were often packed. But amidst the chaos, there was a sense of balance, a mutual understanding that made everything feel possible. "I've been thinking," Grace said softly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. "About what?" I asked, turning to look at her. "About us," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "And how far we've come." Her words hung in the air for a moment, and I nodded. It's been a hell of a journey, I admitted. It has, she agreed. But I think it's only just beginning. She wasn't wrong. Looking back on everything, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the uncertainty, I could see how each step had led me to this moment. Megan's choices had shattered the life I thought I wanted, but they had also opened the door to something far better. Grace wasn't just my partner. She was my equal, my friend, and the person who made the hard days worth it. As the stars began to dot the sky, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small box. It wasn't planned, at least not entirely, but something about the night felt right. "I've been thinking too," I said, my voice steady. Grace's eyes widened as I opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring. "Ethan," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "I've been through enough to know when something's worth fighting for," I said, holding her gaze. "And you, Grace, are worth everything. So, what do you say? Want to keep building this life with me?" For a moment, her eyes filled with tears, and then she nodded, her smile brighter than I'd ever seen. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, of course." As I slipped the ring on her finger, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. This was the life I was meant to live. Not the one I had lost, but the one I had built from its ashes. Grace had been right all along. Clearing out the old had made room for something new, something stronger. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it all.